everyone, and welcome to From Tech to Tech Ethics. My name is Mark Vasquez. I am the Senior Program Manager for IEEE TechEthics, a program at IEEE that drives conversation, debate, and discussion on the ethical and social impacts of technology. I also happen to be an IEEE member and an IEEE-HKN member. Thanks to the HKN team for inviting us to be part of this event, the Eta Kappa Nu team. They've been great collaborators on this. In today's session, we will be hearing from Sophia Wushanley, a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Michigan and an IEEE TechEthics Global Ambassador, part of our volunteer advisory group. I don't want to give away too much of her background as she will cover that during her talk, but I will mention that Sophia's work examines how informational technologies change our institutions and ways of life, especially where those changes expose truths about our values and what we take to be our political rights. We will hear from her about how and why she made the transition from tech to tech ethics. Before we kick things off, though, just a few notes to keep in mind. One thing is you will hear references and see references to tech ethics as two words, such as in the title of the session, which is short for the overall topic of technology ethics, as well as tech ethics as one word, which is the name of the IEEE program. So I want to make that distinction because when you hear Sophia or I talking about tech ethics as two words, we're talking about the general scope of technology ethics. Whereas when we talk about tech ethics, the program, it'll show up as a single word. The first part of today's session will be Sophia presenting, giving a presentation, and she and I will then spend a few minutes in conversation with each other, after which we will open up the floor to Q&A with all of you before we wrap up. So feel free to get those questions ready during the presentation and during our discussion. Make sure to use the chat to pose your questions, and you can post them throughout the time we have here, but we may ask you to repost them when we get to the Q&A so we don't have to go fishing for them later on. All righty, with that, I'm going to give the floor over to Sophia. Sophia, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks for the introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here to talk a little bit about my journey. So I'm going to start by introducing myself. I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Michigan, and I study ethics of technology. And a few of the things that I'm involved in, I run a reading group at the University of Michigan called Knowledge, Information, and Society. And that's an interdisciplinary reading group where we talk with engineers, computer scientists, lawyers, basically anyone who's interested in technology ethics. And we read and talk about articles relating to these subjects. I'm also the director of Minorities in Philosophy, which is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to increasing diversity in philosophy and breaking down the barriers in academia for underrepresented minorities. I'm also part of the MINT Lab, which is an ethics of computing global laboratory where we talk about these issues basically on Zoom every week. And last but certainly not least, I'm, as Mark mentioned, an IEEE TechEthics Global Ambassador. So those are the things that I work on now, but I want to talk a little bit about how I got here. And so, yeah, the aim in this talk really is to use my story to talk about the issues in the ethics of technology. And I hope, I think like the ideal outcome of this would be empowering you as engineers to look at the design choices that you make and the choices you make in building algorithms and in programming as moral choices. I'd also like to offer a different perspective on careers and on professional roles because my path to where I am now has been a bit of a wonky path. And finally, I'd really, this is just part of a larger project that I have, which is really to build a bridge between engineers and ethicists. I think that we need to be in conversation, and I have just as much to learn, if not more, from all of you than you do from me. So that's what I'm hoping to get at in the limited time we have today. Um, so to talk a little bit about what my journey has been, this was a bit of a too long for the title to be ethics to tech ethics to tech ethics, but that is sort of what it's been for me so far. So my undergraduate studies were in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, and then I went on to do master's studies in basically philosophy of technology before that was really recognized as a mainstream philosophy field. Then I worked in industry as a web developer in startups for about 4 years, and now I'm obviously a PhD student. So just to start with where I started off in my undergraduate studies in philosophy, um, I was really interested in ethics and political philosophy. So when I was doing my initial studies as an undergraduate, I was focusing on questions like basically ethics asks you, what should you do? Like, what should I do? What are my normative obligations? How should I behave? And political philosophy is concerned with questions like how should society be structured? When does a person or institution have legitimate power or authority? What kinds of social relations are permissible and impermissible? And these were the questions that I found to be really important and really captured my interest the most when I was an undergraduate. Um, but I later moved on to realizing that a lot of these questions were tied up in what's now called philosophy of technology. And so I had basically gotten a job I was living in France at the time, and I had gotten a job writing reports. And one report that I had to write was on the future of work. And I read this book about big data. And I realized from reading this book that big data and data analysis technologies were really going to restructure society as we know it. And we're going to change the kind of questions that political philosophy is concerned with. So I went on to basically do a deep dive into data ethics, and I wrote a thesis on data ethics during my master's degree. But I realized at the time that I needed more concrete technical knowledge to really feel like I had basically the skills and the background to talk about these issues properly. So that brings me to sort of the next stage. When I started working as a web developer. So I took a course in Ruby, and I started coding websites for startups. So some of you may recognize this picture here. It's a picture of Station F, which is the famous startup incubator in Paris. This is where I worked. And the ethical questions that I had started to think about when I was doing my master's degree really, really started to kind of play a role directly in the sorts of work I was doing. So at the time when I was working, we were instituting the General Data Protection Regulations, which are the EU data regulations, into our websites. And that involved trying to make the websites protective to the user's privacy. But in practice, because we hadn't designed these websites from the start with these principles in mind, it ended up being a lot of sort of Band-Aid fixes with essentially just inserting a lot of pop-ups into all the pages of the websites that I was working on. And so I felt like there was something missing there with the question of, how can we have a data protective attitude while we're at the very beginning stages of building a platform, rather than just trying to insert it later on. I also had concerns about the kind of really influential, like large US tech companies that ended up having a big say in kind of what the options were for the kinds of platforms we could create online. So I'm sure many of you know that Amazon Web Services is huge, is used by almost every startup or tech company Then there were concerns about search engine optimization and like working along Google's framework. And I realized at this point that the programming that I was doing was just completely full of, I want to say, normativity as a philosopher, but that just means full of moral questions, full of ethical questions. And it wasn't just about, questions about how things are and, but also how things should be. So um, this is what brought me to the next stage, which is where I am now. I decided that I wanted to sort of dedicate my life to this work and to thinking about how can we deal with these new questions that are raised by the use of data technologies in basically all of modern life, and how can I use my background in ethics to and my background in technology to build in to create a response that's really informed from both sides. So that's the kind of work that I do as a PhD student at the University of Michigan. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that now. So my research in tech ethics and technology ethics is currently on privacy. I'm trying to figure out essentially what is privacy. So that may seem like a silly question, but really there's a lot of debate about what the scope of privacy is, if privacy is something that's worth protecting, and if so, how can we protect it, especially in today's world where it's no longer a question of things like how do we stop people from being eavesdropped on, or the questions of privacy now are a lot more like questions about the data that's being extracted from people's phones and things like that. So my early stage response to this question is that I think privacy specifies what I want to call informational norms that are needed to protect informational justice. And I'm working on this concept of informational justice, which is trying to answer the question of the norms and the regulations that we need to put in place in order to reduce informational harms. So these might be the harms of informational asymmetry, things like price discrimination and content moderation that's maybe not too clear, not explained, data extraction without true consent of the user, or accidental exposure of sensitive user information. I think because we're still sort of in the early days of this kind of data run society, a lot of these issues are still coming up and causing a lot of harms to individuals on a daily basis. And the idea of informational justice is this idea of trying to draw out the contours of what it requires to use data in a responsible way. So I wanted to finish off by talking a little bit about the work that I engage with and the work that inspires me and that you might find interesting. So if you've heard of anyone who works in philosophy and privacy, it would have been Helen Niestenbaum, I think. She calls privacy the appropriate flow of information, and she has a very very influential concept of privacy that's been used in data regulation policy. So an interesting contribution that she's made to the literature is to say that consent, as in consenting to a privacy policy or consenting to your data being shared online, it's just one kind of principle that can allow data to be legitimately shared. But sometimes the context of a situation isn't appropriate for consent. So consent works in a lot of contexts, but sometimes there are other norms in the context that are maybe more important than giving the person the choice. Maybe there's a presumption that the data is private and it shouldn't be shared. So she talks a lot about not just seeing the internet as one single entity and seeing it as a bunch of different contexts, like the healthcare context can be online, the friendship context can be online, your working context can be online, and these things should probably be separated. It's probably not good to include basically the idea of it's probably not good to sell your personal data from your interpersonal context to your work environment, or vice versa. So that's some interesting work that Niesenbaum does. Also, Professor Kathleen Creel does very interesting work on what she calls the algorithmic leviathan. So this is basically talking about this idea of switching from human decision making in bureaucracies to algorithmic decision making. And human decision making is pretty diverse, and it's subject to the sort of idiosyncrasies of each individual decision maker. But algorithms make decisions at scale, and when you have the same algorithm making decisions for a lot of people, maybe being used by every client in the industry. For example, if you have like a hiring algorithm that's used by every employer, you might find that certain people are then just blocked off the job market because for some reason their profile isn't amenable to the algorithm. And we might have reasons to think we want more diversity in the kinds of algorithms that are then used to make decisions. And then finally, I'm really interested in the work of Langdon Winner, who wrote a piece called Do Artifacts Have Politics? And this work is inspiring to me because he talks about this builder, Robert Moses, who you can see a picture of a bridge here, this which is over the Long Island Parkway. So he built really low bridges over the parkway, and it essentially prevented buses from busing people who lived in the city to Jones Beach in Long Island. And that essentially meant that the low bridges created a kind of class divide between the people who lived below the bridges and the people who lived above the bridges. And that was a political choice that was built into the physical environment. And I think in the same way, online environments can provide even more opportunities to build political choices into the design of the website, for example, or of the algorithm of the database. And so that's work that's pretty inspiring to me. So yeah, I mean, that was sort of a very quick tour of all of the work that I've been doing, and of sort of what led me to this place. And I hope it's been interesting to you, and I'm really excited to engage with you with any questions.
So thank you for that, Sophia. I'll start with some questions, and then we'll open up the floor to the audience to ask theirs as well. And they've already been adding some comments in the chat that I'll get to in a moment. One of the things, and I know we talked about some questions we might want to address, but there were a couple others that came to mind as you were presenting. The first one that came to mind for me was when you spoke about being in the startup space. Having come from a background of ethics and then being in this space and asking yourself the questions about, sort of like why are we doing it this way, and should we be thinking about doing it a different way? Did you find yourself alone in that thinking, or were there others? Did your background present you with the opportunity to ask those questions, or were those questions also being asked by others?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I tended to be since I was in startups, in smaller groups. So it could often be the case that I was the only person. And I think that may have been largely because the other people that I was working with tended to come from engineering schools where their background hadn't been in sort of asking these maybe ethical or political questions, and they understood the sort of technical rules behind how a system was built, and they knew that this system works when it's built this way. So it kind of seemed inevitable that we would continue to build systems in this way and not sort of like why fix it if it's not broken, right? But I do think that, if I engaged my colleagues in conversation with this, they were concerned. They did have underlying concerns about maybe how technology is affecting people in lots of different ways. And I think that generally, even now, as I'm also a teacher in my PhD studies, I teach classes that kids in computer science are taking, they're very, very interested in the ethical questions, and there's a huge appetite for talking about the effects of technology on society and on users online.
Yeah, I thought now of the comment you made at the end about your aims for your presentation. That last one was about building bridges between engineers and ethicists. And that interdisciplinary approach, I think, is becoming more and more important, and will be even more important moving forward, whether it's an individual such as yourself that has that interdisciplinary approach because of your background, or within a team where you have all those voices represented, which as you know, working with the Tech Ethics program is something we focus on all the time, right? Is bringing the legal experts to the table, bringing the policymakers to the table, bringing the the philosophers and the economists, et cetera, to the table. And I think that's becoming more and more important. And you just said something at the end there about working with students and seeing how they're beginning to ask these questions. What role or responsibility do you think that educators have in empowering these future generations of engineers to view their work through that sort of moral or ethical lens?
Yeah, I think educators have a huge role, and that's partially like why I'm pursuing a career in academia. I think is because of this. I think it's only been, to my knowledge, fairly recently that engineering programs in lots of schools have built in a sort of synthesis between the philosophy departments and the engineering schools, and brought in directly ethicists to basically teach classes to the engineering students. And I think that that's hugely important, just because, if you're doing your job as an engineer, you're basing it on what you learned in school. And if it's true, and I think it's true, that there are important moral choices at every stage of building a project. It's not an add-on that we can put in that you learn at the end. It should be something that you're learning right from the beginning, and sort of using it as a lens to see, a lens through which you can analyze the other technical things that you learn.
Right. You spoke earlier in your presentation about or you spoke of design choices as being moral ones rather than ethical ones. And it's funny because I was discussing something similar with some panelists from a recent session that addressed some of the work that IEEE has been doing in this space, and particularly in the space of AI design. And they were intentionally mentioning ethically driven or ethically designed systems rather than just plain ethical systems, which was based on this thought that systems themselves can't be ethical, right? I mean, it's a system; it doesn't have that sort of compass in it. So why do you believe that's an important distinction about the difference between an ethically designed system versus an ethical system? Why is that language important for us to be clear on? And just another question: should we be saying morally driven versus ethically driven or designed?
Yeah, so I'll answer the question for which I have a less interesting answer first. So I think the ethical and moral, I don't really distinguish very much. Like, I don't distinguish between those words in terms of like a jargon thing. It's kind of, I do tend to switch between them, and they don't tend to mean things that are too different. So you can sort of view them as functionally the same. But I think the question of ethically designed system versus ethical system is really deep and important, right? And I think that what I would say on the subject is maybe introduce the idea that so a system cannot inherently be ethical or unethical, just in the same way that like a table cannot be ethical or unethical, right? It's the way that you use it that's going to make it ethical or unethical. But a system does allow for certain futures or certain functions and disallow others. And so if we go back to the example of the low bridges, those bridges aren't ethical or unethical in their just existence as stones, right? But the kind of futures that they allow in the context are that they prevent, I guess, mixing between social classes and mixing between racial groups. And that was a choice that was made that in that context built something unethical into the system. And I think the same thing can be true for the way that we design systems online. So I think like there are lots of choices that platform builders will make. Like an example would be on Facebook, you have to use your legal name to have a profile. And there's a very restricted list of nicknames that are acceptable for each, first name that you have, right? And that's a choice that allows for certain futures and disallows other futures. And it also makes life easier for some people and harder for others, right? So people with maybe foreign names might find it harder if like the nicknames are not recognized, or trans people who haven't had their IDs changed yet might find themselves even just kicked off the platform. So there are lots of ways in which I think something that looks like it's sort of ideologically neutral in the futures it allows or disallows can become sort of political or ethical or moral.
You just mentioned a name that I jotted down that I was going to come back to, Robert Moses, which is sort of a classic example. And being a New Yorker myself, having grown up in New York, I was well aware of the impact that his designs had. And it's interesting because my own background is in engineering, went to engineering school, have a degree in engineering. And just very recently, I heard some of my fellow alums who are in the civil engineering space talking about the huge benefits that Robert Moses brought to the city, while also realizing, or maybe not realizing, that there were all these detriments from those designs as well. So it's an interesting. That's probably an interesting case study in that there were a lot of benefits from those designs, but there were a lot of biases and discriminatory acts that came about as a result, and political ones, as you mentioned. So that sort of dichotomy of so was it right or was it wrong? Through a certain lens, it was right, and through a certain lens, it was wrong. And maybe right and wrong aren't the right terms, but you kind of get what I'm getting at.
Absolutely.
Between the time when you began your university experience at UPenn, right? It was UPenn. You're doing philosophy there. To now, so what have you witnessed or sensed? Have you sensed any sort of shift in the manner in which this topic is being addressed, or the extent to which it's being addressed, whether it be in the academic arena or the professional arena?
Yeah. So I graduated from Penn in 2015, and at that point, if there was anything like technology ethics that had been introduced to philosophy or the sort of ethics world in philosophy, it was probably just a whisper. I think it took a very long time for the most prominent ethicists to acknowledge that there's anything new, and there are any new ethical questions that are raised by technology and the use of data technology specifically. So I think there's just been, in the past, I would say 5-6 years, a huge uptick in the interest in this subject, and for good reason, because it's, I think, exponentially increasing its effect on our daily lives. And people are noticing, we're noticing that we're on our phones all the time, and that, more and more decisions are being made by algorithms, and in good ways and in bad ways. So I think, yeah, just the amount of interest in it and the recognition of it as worth focusing on as its own field has really changed.
Yeah, I jotted something down as you were speaking earlier. I wrote price discrimination down just as a thought. Yeah, I think often when we have conversations like these, or at least when the general public hears about conversations like these, it's these sort of big, sort of massive potential issues. But there are so many sort of smaller ones that are almost hidden, that are so much more pervasive and immediately impactful that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. I mean, the price discrimination thing, which I assume you meant was you can go on a website, and depending on who you are, or where you are, or what your demographic is, you will see a different price.
Yeah.
And that's something that doesn't get a lot of traction, because it's almost like it's in the noise, but that stuff is almost more pervasive than the really big issues, some of which haven't even come to fruition yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's just built into the design such as to be essentially invisible,
Right.
right? And I think that's like you point to this idea of the big issues, which I mean, I know that philosophy kind of got a bad rap for good reason in the early days of philosophy of technology, when all they wanted to focus on was this idea of robots taking over
The world. Yeah.
the world basically, and like AI, like we should just be mainly concerned about AI in terms of scary robots. And I think, there's way too much that's important and interesting in the AI that we use on a daily basis already to end up only focusing on the potential for apocalypse robots.
Yeah. So I want to ask you one last question before we start taking some questions from the audience. So if you're out there and you've posted a question on there, uh, either repost it or flag that you've posted one. We'll get to those in just a minute. I'll end by asking you this, particularly given the audience that we have today, many of whom are students or recent students, young professionals, etc., as well as people who have been in the profession for a while. What would you suggest to a student who's interested in delving more deeply into these themes, as well as somebody who's already a professional? So if you're a student or a professional and you're interested in pursuing or delving more deeply into these, what would you recommend that they do?
Yeah, great. So I think definitely take advantage of any courses that are offered to you still on data ethics, or even if there aren't any, taking a philosophy ethics class if you have a distributive requirement to fulfill. I think that could be really fruitful. I also think just like there's a lot of value in imagining, like we in tech ethics, we tend to focus a lot on what are the worst case scenarios and how to prevent them or stop them, or at least chastise people for building them, right? But there's a lot of value in imagining better ways to use technology and imagining better platforms, fairer algorithms, using that sort of creativity and technical knowledge to think of basically a better future on the internet and in the Internet of Things, for everyone. So I guess that's what I would encourage.
Okay. So I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience. I see one a little while ago from Matt. I like the idea of incorporating norms and regulations as it is developed instead of imposed, but as you mentioned, EU regulations vary from US-based ones. Any suggestions on balancing the different needs in a global economy?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, right? I think that's even harder when you think about, well, there are the EU regulations, there are the US regulations, and then there are, our own moral considerations of what we think, how we think we should build products. I'm not sure I'm the person to say exactly
You
how
don't
those
have the answer?
yeah, I know. I was hoping that the engineers might be able to figure that out. Yeah, I think just moving those considerations to earlier stages in the design process, or the building process, rather than adding them on once a lot of things have already been built, can probably save a lot of headache and allow for more creative solutions. And with my minimal expertise, I'm going to say that.
Would it also be safe to say that it would be worthwhile acknowledging in that upfront process, early in the process, that there are these different audiences with different either regulations in place or sort of cultural norms, and that the products maybe be developed with the sense in mind of, okay, if it's for this market, we build it this way. If it's for this market, we build it differently, as opposed to sort of a one size fits all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this idea of especially when you think of privacy, right? You think of if we're thinking that privacy is something that's partially determined by the context. Well, contexts have cultural norms that are involved in them, right? And depending on your audience, they might be very different. And you don't want to accidentally treat information in a way that the users are not expecting. And so I think that also speaks to a need for more awareness of cultural differences in informational norms. And yeah, I guess that's all I'll say about it, because I don't have um, a, a one size fits all solution or a
Yeah.
recommendation for that.
Yeah, it's funny. I'll just a quick aside. I do remember being approached by someone while I was manning at the table at some event, And half kiddingly, they came up saying, I have this ethical dilemma. Can you give me the answer? And I knew they were saying it sort of tongue in cheek, but my response in part was, at least my viewpoint has always been that it's not so much about. Well, what I said to them right from the start was, if you're looking for the answer, you've come to the wrong place. Because I think what we're really focused on is making sure that people are asking the right questions as opposed to having the
Yeah.
right answer, because that answer may be different depending on the scenario, depending on the context, depending on the geography, depending on the culture. So it's not so much about having the right answer, give me the right answer. It's teach me how to ask the right questions so I can ask those questions in the proper context to get to the answer that's the best answer.
Yeah, totally. Like, I think if I can provide anything that's even just like a useful framework for approaching the question, um, I'm happy with that. Totally agreed.
So any other, I see some comments back and forth. I don't see any other questions. If anybody else has some questions, feel free to post them. I mean, I have some more stuff that I can um, ask Sophia about in the meantime. Um, you talked a bit about, we were just talking about privacy. As example, you mentioned Helen Niesenbaum, and you talked about the way she defines sort of the privacy question. And I know that there were some comments in the chat about how, in the legal space, for example, there are some definitions of privacy, or some stronger definitions of privacy, etc. Can you talk a bit more about sort of what her concept was, and how that has or hasn't to this point shaped privacy regulation?
Yeah, totally. So, um, Helen's intervention was really interesting because um, before her, there was a sort of rough understanding of privacy as something that requires us to stop the flow of information. So, just this idea that privacy should be the thing that says don't share information, don't use information. It's the annoying consideration, right, for anyone who wants to use information. And she said, no, that's not what it is. Privacy is actually just when information is flowing in an appropriate way. And what it means for it to flow in an appropriate way is that the rules of the context, in tandem with who the sender of the information is, who the receiver of the information is, who the subject of the information is, um, those will determine what the right transmission principle is for that information. So an example to make this a little bit like more concrete is, when you're a patient and you tell your doctor medical information about yourself, you're understanding that in that context, it would be, if it's your primary care doctor, if they're going to share that information with a specialist, that's appropriate flow of information. But if they were going to share that information with like the president of your school or your pastor or your neighbor, that would be inappropriate flow of information. And so that doesn't even require necessarily a question of consent or something, because people feel confident that these are the norms when they go to their doctor and they're happy with them. And this idea then can sort of apply to the online context when we say there are lots of ways in which just asking people to consent to a privacy policy is not allowing for information to flow appropriately. And on the contrary, there are lots of situations that you can imagine online where as long as you're following the appropriate norms, you can protect privacy without asking for consent.
So I see Luis mentioned in the context of this, when you think about security as well, global security, that um, another aspect of the reason why these privacy needs are different in some of that context is because of the threats posed by the improper sharing of information is different from nation or to nation, or culture to culture as well, which, in short, is almost saying, yes, this is a complex and even more complex issue. But to what extent have you seen, or to what extent do these sort of threats, let's say, play a role in how that data is shared? And you use sort of a local example of a patient with a doctor, but if you talk about things at sort of at the nation level, for example, how does that case study change?
Yeah. Oh, I think I'm going to answer this question like a slightly off angle, but I think that this speaks to the question. So I think one thing that a new sort of problem that um, data analysis and AI generally, like the advances in these technologies have shown us in recent years, is that the ability of people to infer information that might be considered sensitive information from a bunch of really banal information has become possible. And I think the idea that there's a category of information that's sensitive and another category of information that's fine to share has really gotten muddied by this ability for inference. And so I think then when you bring in the question of in a certain culture or in a certain in a different nation where security is different, different pieces of information can be a security threat than in maybe the country that you're used to working in. So I think that just brings a whole other dimension there as well. And yeah, all I can do is acknowledge that that's a really tricky problem. I don't think I haven't ever really done work on that specifically, on like the idea of international questions related to security, but I do think like very fruitful area for research.
Yeah, the example that that Louise provides in the chat is in the U.S. the threat is mainly economic, whereas in someplace like Rwanda, knowing that you are from a particular culture or background, Tutsi in this example, could cost you and your family your life. In the case of India, they mix census data with banking, with social security, with health. So, you know, again, it speaks to sort of what we were talking about before, where it's about asking the right questions so that you know how to address those in their proper context. And the answer that we were coming up with in US regulation may not be the answer that works in Indian regulation or Rwandan regulation, or, you know, fill in the blank.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And like this is a huge problem if the majority of the sort of structures that we use, the ways that we categorize information, come from the US and then are just sort of applied without consideration to other places. That can cause huge problems. So I think there's probably like a whole field of research that needs to be done in sort of thinking about ways to ethically design I don't know, databases even to be culturally sensitive.
There was a comment that was just popped in here that made me think of something. Lynette said that there are risks with unintended consequences. And I think that's also probably something really important to acknowledge as well, right? It goes back to what I said before. There isn't always necessarily a right or wrong answer. Every decision we make is going to have some impact, some less than ideal impact on some audience or some individual. How do we sort of grapple with that? You know, how do you in the philosophy space sort of grapple with the notion that whatever decision is made, say in the design of an algorithm, may be greatly beneficial in this context, but could also be causing unintended consequences or harms in another? How do we sort of wrap our heads around that?
Yeah. You know, I think we can only do the best with the information we have right now. And I think we're already not doing that most of the time. Not thinking enough about the evidence and prioritizing enough thought about future consequences. And so I think just getting us to that level would be still a worthwhile pursuit, right? And in terms of unintended consequences in the future or things we can't predict, I guess there are ways to minimize that when you think about maybe rolling out features to smaller groups rather than everyone and seeing how it goes. I think a lot of the time people with more technical knowledge than I have will be better at thinking about proximate impacts. So yeah, probably I don't have a satisfying answer to that one, but I think there already is plenty of work that we definitely can do before we get to the even more difficult questions of what do we do when we can't predict the future.
Gotcha. So before we wrap up, and we're getting ready to wrap up in just a few minutes here, I wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of leave a final nugget for the audience. What's one key thing you'd like the audience to walk away with from this discussion?
Yeah. Ooh, that's pressure to give a good answer.
It can be two
Yeah.
or three things if you want it to be two or three. That's fine.
Yeah. I think the most important thing for me in terms of thinking about building a bridge between ethics and engineering is just to think about these platforms that we're building and the things that we're coding as really part of the structure of society and part of a structure of social relationships and institutional relationships that affect people's lives in ways that are really important. So I think rather than just seeing projects as isolated things, an isolated thing that you're working on, seeing it as part of a larger social structure that we really want to optimize to be the best it can be in an ethical sense.
I appreciate that. So before we wrap up, and we're coming at about 2 minutes left, 3 minutes left here, I did want to mention to the audience some related resources that might be of interest to you all. If you are interested in conversations like these and would like to find out more about what IEEE Tech Ethics is and what we do and the work that we do across the IEEE, visit our website at which I'll put in the chat right now. Visit our website at techethics.ieee.org, and you can subscribe to follow our activities. The site also provides access to a host of resources, video recordings of event sessions and interviews with folks, such as with Sophia, articles, publications, education modules, and a whole host of other resources from across the IEEE. And it also provides, on our community page under the About tab, it does provide information on various engagement opportunities, including things like the IEEE Society on Social Implications of Technology. I see that Louis Kuhn is with us today, president of the society, and other groups that are doing work across the IEEE. The Tech Ethics program, the focus of the program has primarily been, as I like to describe it, to try to be the horizontal thread that ties together all the vertical work being done across the IEEE. And SSIT is one example of a vertical, as well as work being done in standards and Robotics and Automation Society and the IEEE Brain Initiative, et cetera. So the idea being that by going to the IEEE Tech Ethics website, you should be able to find your way to any of the related work happening across the IEEE. I'd like to thank Sophia again. Thank you for being here and sharing your story with us, Sophia Wushanley.
Thanks, Mark.
My thanks to Nancy Ostin and the entire Eta Kappa Nu team for hosting us. And of course, thanks to all of you who joined us and engaged with us here, either here live or who are listening online. Feel free to connect with us through the website. There's a contact page there as well. And as I mentioned, Sophia is one of our volunteer ambassadors. So if you'd like to reach her as well, you can reach her through that, and I will put you in touch with her. And with that, I think we can wrap up and enjoy the rest of the conference.